Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Thursday, July 24, 2025. First, Nina stood silently in the back of the floral-draped chapel, her fingers clutching the small folded paper that had been burning a hole in her purse for days. The scent of white roses filled the air as guests whispered and smiled, oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away. Dressed in deep blue, a shade that seemed too dark for a wedding but too muted for mourning, she felt like a stranger among familiar faces. Her gaze remained fixed on Willow, radiant and serene at the altar beside Drew, unaware that the foundations of her perfect day were about to crumble. Nina had warned Drew, told him plainly to walk away before it came to this, but he had ignored her threats with the same arrogance that had always defined him. Now, Nina's resolve had hardened into something colder than anger, determination. For weeks, Nina had carried the truth like a curse. She had uncovered secrets about Drew's manipulations, his quiet involvement in decisions that had affected Willow's recovery, her access to her children, even her freedom. He had wrapped himself in the guise of a protector, but Nina had seen through him. His kindness was calculated. His affection, performative. Nina had confronted him in private, desperate to stop this wedding from becoming a lifelong trap for Willow, but he had dismissed her like a bitter voice from a past he'd already rewritten. That dismissal stung more than she had expected. It ignited in Nina a need not just to warn, but to destroy. As the officiant began to speak, Nina stepped forward, each click of her heels echoing through the aisle like a drumbeat of judgment. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Willow smiled nervously, then frowned. Drew's grip on Willow's hand tightened just as Nina unfolded the paper in her hand and began to speak. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Calm, precise, and deadly, her voice filled the chapel as she exposed Drew's lies, laid bare his betrayals, and confessed her own role in uncovering them. Nina did not spare herself from blame, she admitted she had kept this information quiet for too long. But now, with Willow seconds from binding herself to a man built on deception, she could stay silent no longer. Willow's expression shifted from confusion to horror as the weight of Nina's revelations crushed the fairy tale she had tried to build. Her knees buckled, and for a moment it looked as if Drew would steady her, but she recoiled from him, her eyes wide with betrayal. The guests were frozen in stunned silence as the bride turned from the altar and staggered toward the rear of the church. The ceremony was over. The vows would not be spoken. The kiss would never come. Nina had ensured that the truth destroyed everything it touched. The shattered bouquet still lay on the floor, its petals trampled by haste and heartbreak. In the chaos that followed, Drew attempted damage control, but his pleas were as hollow as the lies that had brought him to this altar. Nina watched him with a mixture of pity and triumph. She hadn't wanted it to unfold this way, not truly. She had dreamt of confronting him in private, of scaring him into letting Willow go peacefully. But Drew had pushed, and now Nina had pushed back. There were no victors here. Only collateral damage. And yet, something in Nina felt strangely at peace. She had done what she had to do, even if it meant being hated for it. Even if it meant losing everything. Later, alone in her apartment, Nina sat by the window as dusk fell over Port Charles. Her hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from exhaustion. She had never set out to destroy Willow's happiness, only to save her from a man who didn't deserve her trust. But the line between savior and saboteur had blurred the moment Nina made the choice to act publicly. She had exposed Drew, yes, but she had also exposed herself, to scrutiny, to judgment, and most painfully, to Willow's devastated eyes. There was no satisfaction in this ending, only silence. And yet, in the silence, Nina could breathe. For the first time in weeks, the burden of secrecy was gone. She didn't know if Willow would ever forgive her. She didn't expect to be thanked. But she had done the one thing that no one else had dared to do, she had told the truth. And in doing so, she had broken the illusion that love built on lies could ever endure. As the moon rose over Port Charles, Nina understood that some hearts must be broken to be truly free. And some weddings must be ruined to save a soul. Second, Willow knelt in the soft grass beside Scout, her fingers gently brushing a crumb from the little girl's white dress as she offered her a slice of cake with the kind of smile that begged for approval. Scout took the plate politely, her thank you so quiet it barely registered above the ambient hum of the wedding celebration. To an outsider, it may have looked like a picture-perfect moment between future stepmother and stepdaughter. A peaceful, promising bond forming under the golden glow of late afternoon. But Alexis, standing at a distance beneath a rose-draped arch, noticed the stiffness in Scout's posture, the absence of joy in her eyes. It wasn't resistance, it was a quiet resignation, a rehearsed politeness that masked something deeper. Alexis had seen this kind of emotional performance before, and it unsettled her. The girl was going through the motions for her father's sake, but it was clear to Alexis that her heart wasn't in it. Later, away from the crowd, Alexis found Drew seated near the edge of the garden, his suit jacket loosened, his glass half full with champagne and his expression tinged with a guarded sort of contentment. She joined him without asking, her movements deliberate, her tone calm but firm. Drew, sensing her seriousness, straightened his posture but remained silent. Alexis had waited until now to speak, not to criticize the ceremony or the emotional spectacle of the vows, but to address something far more personal and pressing, Scout. She gently but directly expressed her concern, explaining that despite Scout's smiles and cooperative behavior, she suspected the child was struggling far more than Drew realized. In Alexis's eyes, Scout didn't dislike Willow, she simply didn't trust her. And that difference mattered. Drew bristled at the suggestion. He quickly countered, claiming that Scout was simply shy, that it was only a matter of time before she warmed up to Willow, that Sam herself supported their arrangement. He sounded rehearsed, like a man repeating what he needed to hear rather than what was true. Alexis, unimpressed, leaned in with quiet urgency, reminding him that children often pretend for the sake of peace, especially when they fear disappointing the people they love. Scout wasn't just adjusting, she was concealing. And that concealment, Alexis feared, could grow into something more damaging if ignored. She didn't accuse Drew of malice, only blindness, but her implication was clear, in pursuing his happiness, he had stopped seeing what his daughter truly needed. She then made a bold proposal, one that she had considered for weeks but had hesitated to voice. If Drew insisted on building a life with Willow, perhaps it would be best for Scout to live with her, at least for a while. Alexis believed she could offer the girl the emotional space and steadiness that neither Drew nor Willow could provide right now. The words landed like stone, and Drew's reaction was swift. He refused. Flatly, with no room for debate. He claimed Alexis was overreacting, that she was reading too much into fleeting moments, and that removing Scout from his care would only create instability. He painted himself as the constant, the anchor, the one who could guide Scout through change better than anyone. But Alexis could see the flaw in his logic. Drew wasn't the anchor, he was the storm. His world had shifted so many times in the past year that Scout was left clinging to routines that no longer existed. The marriage to Willow wasn't a calming conclusion, it was yet another upheaval masked in tulle and confetti. Alexis's voice tightened as she questioned how much of Drew's resistance came from genuine paternal concern and how much came from his pride, his refusal to admit that someone else might know better what Scout was feeling. The silence between them grew brittle. Drew's jaw locked, his hands clenched, but he offered no counterargument, only wounded silence, as if Alexis's words had hit closer than even he wanted to admit. With rising emotion, Alexis reminded him that good parenting wasn't about maintaining appearances or proving loyalty, it was about responding to the unspoken. It was about choosing what was best for the child, even when it was inconvenient or painful. Her voice softened slightly, but her meaning remained sharp. She wasn't asking to take Scout away to hurt Drew, she was asking to protect the little girl from being buried under another one of his perfect plans. She could feel her own frustration boiling over, knowing this conversation would probably change nothing but unable to stay quiet. It wasn't just about Scout anymore, it was about holding Drew accountable for a pattern of self-serving decisions masked as fatherly devotion. Alexis stood, her eyes narrowing with disappointment. She had tried to reach him, to be diplomatic, even generous. But the man before her was too invested in his curated version of fatherhood, unwilling to admit fault or consider alternatives. As she walked away, her heart ached not only for Scout but for Drew, too, a man so determined to be the hero of his own story that he didn't see he was slowly losing the trust of the only person who truly needed him to listen. Scout would continue to smile for him, no doubt, but those smiles would grow thinner, more forced, until one day she stopped pretending altogether. And when that day came, Alexis feared Drew would find himself not only alone, but too late. Third, Trina stood tall and unwavering, a quiet storm of clarity and conviction that refused to be swayed by apologies or regret. Even as Kai stood before her, his eyes filled with sorrow and his voice heavy with remorse, she did not budge. She listened without interruption, allowing him the dignity of expressing his regret, but her silence wasn't softness, it was finality. There was once a time when Kai's words would have meant everything to her, when a tearful apology might have opened a door to forgiveness. But that time had passed, and Trina had grown into someone who understood that love could not survive where trust had been shattered. What Kai had done wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of everything and everyone she held dear. Kai's plea to return to what they once had felt hollow to Trina, not because his pain wasn't real, but because it came too late. He had chosen a path that led directly through the heart of her family's suffering, aligning himself with Drew at a time when Drew's schemes had torn through the lives of those she loved. Curtis had been humiliated, pushed to the brink of ruin, and the cohesion of their family had nearly collapsed. And yet, in the midst of all that chaos, Kai had stood by Drew, justified it, defended it, and in doing so, abandoned Trina and everything they had once built together. That kind of betrayal wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. For Trina, forgiveness wasn't about cruelty or vengeance, it was about integrity. She couldn't pretend that Kai's decisions hadn't left scars, or that his guilt now could erase the damage already done. She had watched Curtis, once so confident and assured, be reduced to a man fighting to reclaim his dignity. She had watched her family scramble to make sense of what had happened, trying to hold on to each other while the ground shifted beneath them. And while all of that unfolded, Kai had remained on the other side, silent when it mattered, present in all the wrong places. Trina could not look past that, no matter how much of her heart still ached for what they had lost. What angered her most wasn't just Kai's alliance with Drew, it was Kai's refusal to see the truth about who Drew had become. Drew had worn the mask of a savior, but Trina had learned the hard way that he was anything but. He had manipulated, controlled, and maneuvered people into corners they couldn't escape from, all while pretending to offer them freedom. Trina didn't want revenge, but she did want accountability. She needed Kai to stop idealizing the man who had caused so much harm, to open his eyes and truly reckon with what he had supported. Without that, any reconciliation between them would be built on sand. Even now, as Kai stood in front of her, broken and aching, Trina could see that part of him still clung to the idea that Drew had been misunderstood or misled. That made her heart sink more than any of his previous mistakes. She needed more than remorse. She needed clarity, a shared understanding of the truth. Until Kai could look her in the eye and name the betrayal for what it was, they would remain on opposite sides of an invisible wall, one that neither love nor regret could break through. Trina wasn't being cruel, she was protecting the part of herself that had learned to stop accepting apologies in place of change. As the conversation faded into silence, Trina felt no satisfaction in denying him. It hurt to let go of someone who had once meant so much, but she knew she deserved more than a love built on denial. She turned away not out of spite, but out of necessity. Her heart had been bruised too many times by promises that dissolved when tested. Kai's tears, sincere as they were, could not undo the choices that had already taken root in her memory. Trina walked forward with strength, knowing she wasn't walking away from love. She was walking toward self-respect, and that was something no apology could ever outweigh. In the quiet that followed, Trina didn't cry. She didn't crumble. Instead, she exhaled the weight of years spent hoping others would choose what was right. She had chosen herself this time, and in that decision, she found a kind of peace. Kai would have to confront his reflection on his own terms. If he truly wanted redemption, it would have to begin with truth, not tears. Until then, Trina's heart would remain closed, not out of bitterness, but because she finally understood that real love doesn't come at the expense of one's values, and she would never again sacrifice her soul for someone else's denial. Finally, it felt almost surreal, like stepping into a forgotten memory, when Lisel and Elizabeth unexpectedly crossed paths in the hospital corridor. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the distant echo of heart monitors faded into the background as the two women locked eyes. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Time seemed suspended in that narrow stretch of hallway, where so many ghosts had once lingered and so many unspoken words had remained buried. But then, with a sudden rush of warmth, smiles broke across both their faces, and they closed the space between them with an embrace that was as fierce as it was overdue. It wasn't just a greeting, it was the release of years of tension, misunderstandings, grief, and survival. There had been a time when trust between them had been brittle, fractured by conflicting loyalties and personal tragedies, but that day, none of it mattered. Elizabeth could feel the difference in Lisel's hug. It wasn't the cool, guarded touch of a woman keeping score. It was genuine, soft around the edges, filled with a kind of quiet gratitude that neither had ever known how to express before. When they finally pulled apart, both were a little misty-eyed, but neither bothered to wipe the tears. They were past pretending to be invincible. They had earned this moment, the reunion of two women who had been tested by fate more than once and had come out standing. They found a quiet corner in the hospital cafeteria, both cradling mugs of coffee that had long gone cold by the time they began talking in earnest. Elizabeth spoke first, gently unfolding the stories of her sons, the toll of recent months, the nights she'd spent trying to hold together not only her own heart but the hearts of everyone around her. She spoke of grief, of Franco, of Epiphany, of the loneliness that settled in her bones during the quiet hours of night shifts and early mornings. She also spoke of hope, of Cameron's resilience, of Jake's return to light, of the strange peace that came with simply surviving. Lisel listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth's face, absorbing every word like scripture. Then it was Lisel's turn, and her voice softened in ways Elizabeth had rarely heard. She spoke of Brit, not just her death, but her spirit, how she still felt her daughter's presence in the quietest corners of her life. She admitted that the pain hadn't dulled, not really, but it had become a companion she had learned to live with. Lisel told Elizabeth about her decision to step away from revenge, to stop chasing shadows, to try to be someone her daughter would be proud of. She confessed how strange it felt to live without war in her heart. The fire hadn't gone out, it had simply changed shape. It burned now for healing, for legacy, for redemption. They laughed, too. Not everything was heavy. They remembered the absurdities of the hospital halls, the wild things they'd once said in anger or fear, and how time had washed those moments clean. They teased each other about old grudges and strange choices, and for the first time in a long while, Elizabeth saw in Lisel not just the complicated woman with a shadowy past, but a friend, a real friend, who had survived just as fiercely and fully as she had. Their laughter echoed softly through the walls, a sound of life reclaiming space in a building so often dominated by sorrow. There was healing in the rhythm of their conversation, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them had walked an easy road, but both had found reasons to keep going. They talked about the patients who had come and gone, about how the hospital itself seemed to shift with each passing year. Lisel admitted how strange it was to walk its halls without Brit, but also how comforting it was to see familiar faces like Elizabeth still anchoring the place. Elizabeth, in turn, said that seeing Lisel was like finding something she hadn't known was missing, proof that even the most unlikely bonds could survive, and even blossom, through time. Eventually, the light began to fade through the cafeteria windows, and the hospital hum grew louder again as the day marched on. But neither woman seemed in a rush to leave. They sat in that sliver of peace carved out of chaos, letting the silence settle comfortably between them. Words were no longer necessary. The reconnection had been made. Whatever came next, whatever storms or losses or quiet triumphs, they would face them not alone, but with the knowledge that someone else understood the weight they carried. When they finally stood to part ways, there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. Only a mutual sense of respect and affection. Lisel reached out and placed her hand briefly on Elizabeth's arm, a gesture that spoke volumes. There was no promise to meet again soon, no dramatic farewell. Just a glance that said, "We're still here. We made it. We are not what we were, but we are still whole." And for both women, that was enough. As Elizabeth walked away, her heart felt strangely lighter. It wasn't just the joy of reunion. It was the realization that some relationships, no matter how complicated, have a way of coming full circle. And as Lisel turned down the corridor in the opposite direction, she smiled to herself, not with sadness, but with something gentler, more forgiving.